I've stayed in countless hotels over the years, but there's one stay I'll never forget. I'll never book a room in that place again, not because of the bad service or uncomfortable beds, but because of what I saw, what I experienced. It was a business trip in the middle of nowhere, Illinois. My company had booked me into this old-fashioned hotel, the kind that looks like it hasn't been renovated since the 70s. The exterior was unassuming, even a little charming. Brick facade, a cracked neon sign buzzing faintly in the evening light, and a dim parking lot with just a few cars scattered around. When I walked inside, I noticed a strange smell right away. Not overpowering, but faintly metallic, like rusted iron. The receptionist, a woman who looked exhausted beyond her years, didn't even ask for my ID. She slid me the key and mumbled, "Room 303. The elevator creaked and shuddered as it climbed. I was already uneasy, but I chalked it up to exhaustion and overwork. When the doors opened, the hallway stretched out long and dim. The carpet was old and threadbare, patterned with faded floral prints that looked like they were wilting. I found my room easily enough and pushed open the door. The air inside was still, thick and stale. The metallic smell was stronger here, but I ignored it. It wasn't the first time I'd stayed in a rundown hotel. The room was simple, a queen bed, a desk, and an old tube TV perched on a dresser. The wallpaper was peeling at the edges, curling slightly. At first, nothing seemed unusual. I unpacked my things, sat on the bed, and scrolled through my emails. But then, as I was getting ready to shower, I noticed something odd. The mirror in the bathroom was warped, like the glass had been stretched and melted. My reflection looked strange, distorted. I leaned closer, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement in the glass, something behind me. My heart jumped and I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty bathroom. I laughed nervously and brushed it off. Long day, I thought. Too much coffee, not enough sleep. After my shower, I turned on the TV for background noise and climbed into bed. The metallic smell seemed stronger now, like it was seeping into the sheets. But I was too tired to care. I shut off the lights and tried to sleep. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of faint tapping. It was rhythmic, soft but insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the wall behind the bed. My first thought was plumbing. Old hotels often have pipes that make noise at night. But the tapping didn't stop. I sat up, listening. The sound grew louder, closer, like it was moving. Tap, tap, tap. Now it sounded like it was coming from inside the room, near the corner. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and the air felt heavier. I tried to go back to sleep, but something kept nagging at me. I kept staring at the warped mirror in the bathroom, visible from where I lay in bed. In the faint light from the TV, the surface of the mirror looked almost alive, like it was rippling, as though something was pressing against it from the other side. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Then I saw it, a shape. It was faint, but unmistakable. A dark silhouette moving inside the mirror, just beyond the surface. It wasn't my reflection. It wasn't even human. I froze, paralyzed by fear. The figure pressed closer, and I swear I saw its hand, long, thin fingers, almost skeletal, push against the glass. The warped surface bulged outward, as though it was trying to break through. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The tapping started again, louder this time, coming from all around the room. Tap, tap, tap. It was frantic, erratic, like dozens of hands drumming on the walls, the floor, the ceiling. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The room was empty, but the sound didn't stop. I stumbled out of bed, heart pounding, and bolted for the door. As I fumbled with the lock, I glanced back at the mirror. The figure was still there, its face pressed against the glass. Its mouth was open, but no sound came out. Its eyes, dark, empty voids, stared straight at me. I finally managed to unlock the door and ran into the hallway. The corridor was completely dark. The lights that had been dim earlier were now out entirely. The air was freezing, and the metallic smell was overwhelming. It felt like it was clogging my throat. I ran for the elevator, but when I reached it, the doors were open, and the inside was pitch black. There was no way I was getting in. I turned and sprinted down the stairs instead. Every step echoed loudly in the stairwell, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. When I reached the lobby, it was empty. No receptionist, no other guests, just silence. I didn't stop running until I was outside, in my car. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced back at the hotel. In one of the third-floor windows, I saw a figure, a shadow, watching me. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I ended up sleeping in my car in a rest stop that night. The next morning, I called the company and told them I wouldn't be staying there another night. I didn't explain why. I didn't think they'd believe me. Later, I tried to look up the hotel online. There was almost nothing about it. No reviews, no recent photos, just a few vague mentions of it being historically significant and rumors about disappearances in the area. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was a hallucination, or maybe I was just overtired. But every now and then, I dream about that mirror. And in the dream, the figure isn't trapped anymore.
Story number 2.
I was never a believer in the paranormal. Ghosts, spirits, haunted places, it all seemed like folklore, exaggerated stories meant to spook gullible people. But everything changed during a business trip 2 years ago when I stayed at the Hollow Pines Inn. The hotel was cheap and convenient, located right off the highway in Missouri. It wasn't much to look at, just 2 stories of faded brick with a sagging awning over the front entrance. It was one of those places you book last minute because the price is too good to pass up. The man at the front desk greeted me with an odd smile. His teeth were yellowed, his eyes bloodshot, like he hadn't slept in days. He handed me a heavy brass key, an actual key, not a key card, and said in a raspy voice, "Room 217, top floor." As I walked to my room, the air felt heavier the closer I got. The hallway lights were dim, flickering faintly. The wallpaper was torn in spots, revealing patches of dark wood beneath. I tried not to think about how eerily quiet it was. No distant sounds of TVs, no voices, no footsteps, just silence. When I entered the room, I immediately felt off. The air was cold, even though it was mid-July, and the window was shut tight. The room smelled faintly of mildew, but there was something else beneath it, something sharp and acrid that I couldn't place. The room itself was unremarkable. An old queen bed with a faded floral comforter, a dresser, and a small table by the window. But my eyes were drawn to one thing, a large wooden wardrobe in the corner. It didn't match the rest of the furniture, like it had been dragged in from another era. The wardrobe was tall and ornate, carved with intricate patterns of vines and flowers. The wood was dark and polished, but the inside of the carvings was black, like soot had settled into the grooves. I couldn't explain it, but the wardrobe made me uneasy. I set my bags down and tried to settle in. After a quick dinner from a vending machine, I lay down, trying to unwind with my phone. That's when I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, a soft, rhythmic creak, like wood shifting under pressure. It was coming from the wardrobe. I froze, staring at it. My logical brain told me it was nothing, just an old piece of furniture settling, but my gut screamed otherwise. I got up slowly and walked toward the wardrobe. With every step, the creaking grew louder. I reached out, gripping the cool brass handle, and yanked the door open. Nothing. The wardrobe was empty. I laughed nervously, feeling ridiculous. I was letting an old piece of furniture get to me. I shut the door, making sure it latched, and went back to bed. The next sound came about an hour later, just as I was drifting off. This time, it wasn't a creak. It was a scratching noise, faint but deliberate, like nails dragging across wood. I bolted upright. It was coming from inside the wardrobe. My heart was pounding as I stared at it. The door, which I had latched earlier, was now slightly ajar. I wanted to leave. Every instinct told me to grab my bags and run, but I was too scared to move. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, that I was overreacting. I turned on the lamp by the bed and grabbed my phone, deciding to distract myself until I calmed down. But as I sat there, I noticed something. The shadows in the room didn't look right. The wardrobe cast a long, dark shadow on the wall, but it wasn't still. It moved, shifting unnaturally, like something was writhing inside it. I stared, unable to look away, as the shadow stretched and twisted. It wasn't the shape of the wardrobe anymore. It was something else, something with long, thin limbs and a hunched back. Then, the door of the wardrobe swung open. I didn't see what was inside. I didn't wait. I grabbed my bag and ran. The hallway was just as quiet and dark as before, but now I could hear something behind me, soft, shuffling footsteps, getting closer. I didn't dare look back. When I reached the lobby, the man at the front desk was gone. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a vending machine in the corner. I ran outside, fumbling with my car keys, and sped out of the parking lot without looking back. I drove for miles before I finally pulled over at a gas station to catch my breath. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I checked into a different hotel that night, a bright, modern chain hotel that felt safe and ordinary. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow twisting on the wall. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just an old, creaky hotel playing tricks on my tired mind. Maybe the shadows were just a trick of the light. But then I looked at my phone. In my panic to leave, I must have hit the camera button without realizing it. There was a photo in my gallery taken inside the room. It was blurry, dark, but I could make out the wardrobe in the corner, and the door was open. Something was inside. A shape, faint but unmistakable, crouched low, with long limbs and glowing eyes staring straight at the camera. I deleted the photo immediately. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I've tried to find information about the Hollow Pines Inn, but there's almost nothing online. The hotel doesn't even seem to exist anymore. There's no listing for it, no records of it anywhere. Sometimes I wonder if it was even real. But then I remember the photo, and I know it was.
Story number 3.
It started as a simple weekend getaway. My boyfriend Tyler and I decided to take a break from the city and book a stay at a quaint little hotel in the Appalachian Mountains. It was the kind of place people described as charming and cozy, tucked away from the chaos of modern life. The Ridgeway Inn wasn't luxurious, but its rustic appeal was exactly what we wanted. The building was old, with creaky wooden floors and a front porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The innkeeper, a gaunt man in his 60s named Mr. Harlan, greeted us with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Room 6, he said, handing us a brass key attached to a leather fob. His voice was low and gravelly, as if he didn't get many visitors. "Breakfast is at 7. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call the desk." The room was on the second floor, at the end of a long hallway lit by flickering sconces. The door creaked loudly as Tyler unlocked it and pushed it open. Inside, the room was simple, a queen bed with a quilted cover, a small dresser, and a chair by the window. But the air felt wrong, heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. "Cozy," Tyler said with a grin, tossing his bag onto the bed. I forced a smile, trying to ignore the chill that crept up my spine. We spent most of the day hiking, enjoying the crisp mountain air and the crunch of leaves underfoot. By the time we got back to the inn, it was nearly dark. We showered, changed, and settled into bed, both exhausted from the day's trek. That's when the noises started. It began as a faint tapping sound, like fingernails lightly rapping against wood. At first, I thought it was the old building settling, but the noise was rhythmic, deliberate. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, nudging Tyler. He groaned, half asleep. "It's probably just the wind." I wasn't so sure. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the wall behind the bed. "Tyler," I hissed, shaking him awake. "What?" he mumbled, sitting up. The tapping stopped. We stared at the wall in silence, but the room felt alive, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. "See?" he said, lying back down. "Nothing. Go to sleep." But I couldn't. Something was off, and I knew it. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. The room was pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallows everything. Even with my eyes open, I felt disoriented, like the walls were closing in. And then I heard it again. This time, it wasn't tapping. It was a soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. "Tyler?" I whispered, shaking him again. He didn't respond. I turned to face him, but froze. He was lying on his back, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. His mouth was slightly ajar, his chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths. "Tyler?" I said, my voice trembling. No response. I leaned closer, and that's when I saw his eyes. They weren't just open, they were vacant, glassy, like he wasn't really there. I shook him harder, panic rising in my chest. "Tyler, wake up!" His lips moved, but the words that came out weren't his. "They're coming," he said in a voice that was flat, monotone. "What? Who's coming?" I asked, my heart racing. He didn't answer. Instead, his eyes slowly turned toward the corner of the room. I followed his gaze, and my stomach dropped. In the corner, just beyond the reach of the moonlight filtering through the window, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long. Its head was tilted to the side, and its face, if you could call it that, was featureless, just a smooth expanse of pale skin. It didn't move, but I felt its presence like a weight, pressing down on my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. And then it started to move. It didn't walk, it glided, silently, its long arms swaying slightly as it approached the bed. I grabbed Tyler, shaking him desperately. "Tyler, wake up! Please." He didn't respond, he just kept staring at the figure, his lips moving silently now, as if he were chanting something I couldn't hear. The figure stopped at the foot of the bed, towering over us. It leaned down, its head tilting closer to mine, and I swear I could feel its cold breath on my skin. Finally, I found my voice. I screamed. The sound seemed to break whatever spell Tyler was under. He gasped, sitting up abruptly, his eyes wide and alert. "What's wrong? What happened?" he asked, looking around the room. But the figure was gone. I was shaking, tears streaming down my face as I tried to explain what I'd seen. Tyler looked skeptical but concerned. He got up and turned on every light in the room, checking the closet, the bathroom, even under the bed. "There's nothing here," he said, pulling me into a hug. It was just a nightmare. But it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. I refused to stay in that room another second. We packed our bags and left in the middle of the night, driving down the dark mountain roads until we found a diner that was open 24/7. The waitress must have seen the fear in my eyes because she didn't ask questions. She just poured us coffee and let us sit in silence. The next morning, we called the inn to explain why we'd left, but no one answered. When we drove back to the Ridgeway Inn to retrieve the belongings we'd forgotten in our haste, the building looked different. The windows were boarded up, the front porch overgrown with weeds. A faded, "No trespassing" sign hung crookedly on the door. It looked like it had been abandoned for years.
Story number 4.
The night I checked into the Cedarwood Lodge, I was just looking for a quiet place to sleep. Driving cross-country had left me exhausted, and I wasn't picky. It was late, and I spotted the lodge off the highway, a modest 2-story building surrounded by dense woods. The place had an eerie charm. The wooden sign out front was old and faded, and the parking lot was nearly empty. Inside, the receptionist, a woman with sharp features and an unsettlingly stiff smile, handed me a key. "Room 208, she said, her voice clipped. "Please respect the quiet hours. And if you hear anything unusual, don't open the door." I blinked. "What do you mean by that?" She didn't answer. She just slid the key across the counter, her hand lingering there for a moment too long. I shrugged it off and headed upstairs, chalking her warning up to small-town weirdness. The hallway on the second floor was dimly lit, with wallpaper peeling in the corners. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something else I couldn't quite place, a sour, metallic tang. I found my room at the end of the hall and unlocked the door. The room was simple, a bed, a small desk, and a bulky old TV. The window overlooked the woods, and the branches outside scratched lightly against the glass. I dropped my bag on the bed and locked the door behind me, the receptionist's strange words still echoing in my mind. I told myself to relax. It was late, and I was overthinking things. After a quick shower, I climbed into bed, the old springs creaking under my weight. That's when the first sound came, a faint knock at the door. It was soft, almost hesitant. I froze, my hand halfway to the remote. Knock, knock, knock. I glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. Who would be knocking at this hour? "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. I got out of bed and approached the door cautiously. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing. The hallway was empty. I hesitated, then unlocked the door and cracked it open. The hall stretched out in both directions, silent and still. Shaking my head, I closed the door and double-locked it. Probably just some kid messing around, I muttered to myself. I climbed back into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Around 2 a.m., the sound started again. This time, it wasn't knocking. It was a faint, scraping noise, like nails dragging across the wood of the door. The sound sent a chill down my spine. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The scraping stopped. Then the doorknob rattled as if someone was trying to turn it. I jumped out of bed and backed away from the door. The knob twisted, but the lock held. "Leave me alone," I shouted. The rattling stopped. I stood there, trembling, staring at the door. For several long minutes, nothing happened. The silence was almost worse than the noise. Finally, I crept back toward the door and pressed my ear against it, listening. That's when I heard it. A whisper, faint and hoarse, coming from the other side. "Let me in." I stumbled backward, my chest tightening with fear. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The whisper came again, louder this time, insistent. "Let me in." I grabbed my phone and dialed the front desk. The line rang and rang, but no one picked up. Come on, I muttered, my fingers shaking as I tried again. Still no answer. The whispering continued, growing more frantic. Let me in, please, let me in. Then came the knocking again, harder this time, more insistent. Bang, bang, bang. I backed into the corner of the room, clutching my phone like it could somehow protect me. The banging stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was silence. And then the voice spoke again. It's already inside. I froze. My blood turned to ice as the realization dawned on me. The voice wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. The room was dark, but in the faint moonlight filtering through the window, I saw something. A figure stood in the corner, its silhouette impossibly tall and thin. Its arms hung unnaturally long at its sides, and its head tilted slightly, as if it were studying me. Its face, or what should have been its face, was featureless. Smooth, pale skin stretched across where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Let me in, it whispered, though its mouth didn't move. I backed up until I hit the wall, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My hands scrambled for the lamp on the bedside table, and I flicked it on. The light flooded the room, and the figure was gone. I stood there, trembling, the lamp's warm glow doing little to calm my nerves. Grabbing my bag, I bolted for the door. I didn't care about the time, about checking out. I just needed to get out of that room. The hallway was empty, the air heavy and oppressive. As I descended the stairs to the lobby, I noticed something strange. The wallpaper was peeling in large chunks, revealing dark, moldy wood beneath. The lights flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows. When I reached the front desk, it was empty. The receptionist was gone, and the old rotary phone sat there, disconnected. I stepped outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. The parking lot was eerily quiet, and as I got into my car, I glanced back at the lodge. In one of the second-floor windows, my window, I saw it. The figure was standing there, watching me, its smooth face pressed against the glass. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I drove all night, not stopping until I was miles away at a rest area on the side of the highway. The next day, I tried to look up Cedarwood Lodge online, but I couldn't find any record of it. No reviews, no website, nothing. It was like the place didn't exist, but I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I hear that voice again. Let me in.
Story number 5.
It was supposed to be the perfect road trip. I was driving from Chicago to Denver, taking the scenic route through rural Illinois. Late into the evening, rain began to pour, drenching the empty highways in sheets of water. My plan was to drive through the night, but exhaustion hit harder than I expected. Just as I started considering pulling over, a flickering neon sign appeared in the distance. Hollow Creek Motel, it read, glowing faintly through the downpour. Relieved, I turned into the gravel driveway, my tires crunching on the loose rocks. The motel was a single-story structure with a row of rooms, their doors painted a dull, peeling green. The parking lot was nearly empty except for an old, rusted station wagon parked in the corner. I ran inside, shaking off the rain. Behind the counter sat a middle-aged woman with stringy gray hair and a cigarette dangling from her lips. She looked up, her bloodshot eyes narrowing. "Need a room?" she asked in a scratchy voice. "Yes, please," I replied, handing over my credit card. She slid me a key without bothering to check the card. "Room 5, she muttered. "Checkout's at 10. Don't wander around after midnight." I frowned. "Why not?" Her lips twitched into a half smile, but she didn't answer. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just a small-town quirk. Room 5 was halfway down the row, and I hurried inside, eager to escape the cold rain. The room was functional. A bed, a tiny TV, and a worn armchair. The wallpaper was faded and peeling in places, and the carpet smelled faintly of dampness. Still, it was dry, and I was too tired to care. After a quick shower, I collapsed onto the bed, scrolling through my phone. The rain outside intensified, thunder rumbling in the distance, and then the knocking started. It was faint at first, 3 soft taps on the door. Knock, knock, knock. I froze, staring at the door. It was nearly midnight. Who would be out there in this weather? "Hello?" I called out, my voice unsteady. No response. I hesitated, then crept up to the door and looked through the peephole. The hallway outside was empty. Feeling a chill creep up my spine, I locked the deadbolt and crawled back into bed. "It's just the wind," I told myself, pulling the covers up to my chin. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At 12:15, the knocking returned. This time it was louder. Knock, knock, knock. I shot upright in bed, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I shouted. Silence. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it toward the door. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and writhe in the dim light. As I stared at the door, I heard it, a soft, muffled voice coming from the other side. "Let me in." I froze. The voice was high-pitched, almost childlike, but distorted like it was being played through an old, broken speaker. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Let me in," the voice repeated. I backed away from the door, my hands trembling. Suddenly, the knocking turned frantic, louder, faster, more desperate. Bang! 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 "Let me in!" the voice screamed, now shrill and piercing. I stumbled backward, tripping over the corner of the bed and landing hard on the floor. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The room was silent except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I scrambled to my feet, clutching my phone like a lifeline. I didn't dare approach the door again. Instead, I sat in the corner of the room, the flashlight casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. And that's when I heard it, a soft creak. It was coming from the bathroom. I turned slowly, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I aimed it toward the bathroom door. It was slightly ajar, and beyond it, the darkness seemed to pulse and shift. "Hello?" I whispered, my throat dry. No response. I stood up, my legs shaking, and inched toward the bathroom. The air grew colder with every step, and the faint smell of mildew grew stronger. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I pushed it open. The bathroom was empty. The shower curtain hung limp, the sink was dry, and the mirror was fogged over, even though the air was freezing. I let out a shaky breath, feeling a flicker of relief. But then, I saw it. In the fogged-up mirror, there was something behind me. A shadowy figure, tall and gaunt, with hollow black eyes and a twisted grin that stretched impossibly wide. Its head tilted unnaturally like it was studying me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. I ran out of the bathroom, grabbing my bag and fumbling with the lock on the door. As I yanked it open, I stopped cold. The hallway outside was different. The walls were lined with peeling, water-stained wallpaper, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. The air smelled of rot and decay, and the lights flickered faintly, casting long, warped shadows. Something was wrong. I stepped out into the hallway, clutching my bag tightly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing strangely. No answer. I started walking, my footsteps stirring up small clouds of dust. The other doors along the hallway were shut tight, but as I passed room 7, I heard it. A faint whisper coming from inside. I froze, pressing my ear to the door. The whispering grew louder, though I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like several voices overlapping, rising and falling in a strange, discordant rhythm. Suddenly, the door creaked open, just a crack. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "Hello?" I whispered again, peering into the darkness beyond the door. Something moved inside. A shadow, shifting and writhing like smoke trapped in a bottle. And then a face appeared in the gap. Pale, hollow-eyed, with that same twisted grin. "Why don't you stay?" it whispered. I screamed, dropping my bag and running. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in as I sprinted toward the exit. Finally, I burst through the front door and into the rain, gasping for air. The parking lot was empty. My car was gone. Desperate, I turned back toward the motel, but the building was different. The neon sign was dark, the windows shattered, and the walls covered in graffiti and ivy. It looked abandoned, like it had been for decades. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. It wasn't until I reached the highway and flagged down a passing truck that I realized how lucky I was to get out. The driver, an older man with a kind face, listened as I stammered out what had happened. When I mentioned the Hollow Creek Motel, his expression darkened. "That place burned down years ago," he said. "Killed a bunch of folks trapped inside. You're lucky you didn't stop there." I stared at him, my skin crawling. "I did," I whispered.
Story number 6.
The drive through the back roads of Southern Virginia was supposed to be a shortcut. I had left the main highway hours ago, trusting my GPS to guide me, but the endless winding roads through dense woods were beginning to feel like a mistake. It was past midnight, and the fog hanging low over the trees made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. When I saw the sign for the Willow Vale Inn, I nearly sighed with relief. It was small, almost hidden by the mist. but the warm glow of lights spilling from the windows promised a reprieve from the cold and isolation. I parked my car in the gravel lot and grabbed my bag, making my way to the entrance. The inn looked like something out of another century, an old Victorian-style house with intricate woodwork and a wide wraparound porch. The paint was peeling, and the windows had a slight grime to them, but it felt welcoming enough. Inside, the lobby smelled of old wood and lavender. A man stood behind the counter, his face pale and thin, with deep-set eyes that seemed to bore into me. He wore a vest and tie that looked oddly old-fashioned, like he had stepped out of a black-and-white photograph. "Welcome," he said, his voice calm and measured. "We don't get many visitors this late." "Just passing through," I replied, shifting my bag on my shoulder. "Do you have a room for the night?" He nodded slowly and handed me a key. "Room 13, he said, his lips curling into a faint smile. I hesitated. "Really? Room 13? He chuckled, the sound low and humorless. "It's just a number." Too tired to argue, I thanked him and made my way up the creaking staircase. The hallway was dimly lit with faded wallpaper and worn carpet that muffled my footsteps. Room 13 was at the very end, and as I approached, I felt a faint chill in the air, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The room was small, with a four-poster bed draped in heavy, faded curtains. A single window looked out into the dark woods, and an antique dresser stood against one wall. The air smelled faintly of mothballs and something else, something metallic. I locked the door behind me and set my bag down, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me. "It's just an old inn," I muttered to myself. "Stop being ridiculous." After a quick shower, I climbed into bed, pulling the heavy quilt over me. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustling of the trees outside. I was just beginning to drift off when I heard it, a faint scratching sound. It was so soft at first that I thought I was imagining it. But as the seconds passed, it grew louder, more insistent. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was coming from the dresser. I sat up, my heart pounding, staring at the dark shape of the furniture across the room. The scratching continued, steady and deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. Summoning my courage, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming the beam toward the dresser. Nothing. The scratching stopped as soon as the light hit it, and the room fell silent again. I let out a shaky breath and lay back down, telling myself it was just an old building settling. But then the knocking began. 3 sharp knocks coming from the inside of the dresser. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The knocks came again, louder this time, shaking the flimsy piece of furniture. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The knocks stopped, replaced by a faint, whispering voice. "Let me out." I bolted out of bed, my phone shaking in my hand as I approached the dresser. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, repeating the same words over and over. "Let me out! Let me out! Let me out!" My hand hovered over the drawer handle, every instinct screaming at me to stop. But before I could make a decision, the drawer slid open on its own. Inside was nothing. The drawer was empty, save for a faint smear of something dark and dried near the back. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving the room in a suffocating silence. I slammed the drawer shut and backed away, my chest heaving. That's when I noticed the mirror. It hung on the wall above the dresser, its surface cracked and fogged. In its reflection, the room looked darker, distorted, as though it were stretching and twisting. And in the corner of the room, just behind me, I saw it. A figure. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. Its hands were long and skeletal, and its head tilted unnaturally to one side. I spun around, but there was nothing there. When I turned back to the mirror, the figure was closer. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the bed. My phone slipped from my hand, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the room. The mirror began to vibrate, the cracks spreading like spider webs. The air grew thick, and the metallic smell intensified, making it hard to breathe. "Leave," a voice hissed, low and guttural. The mirror shattered, shards of glass raining down onto the dresser. I didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing my bag, I bolted for the door, yanking it open and sprinting down the hallway. The walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing longer and darker with every step. When I reached the lobby, the man at the counter was gone. The room was dark, the fireplace cold and empty. I threw open the front door and ran to my car, fumbling with the keys. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the inn. In one of the upstairs windows, I saw the figure again, watching me. Its head tilted slowly, its hand raised in a mocking wave. I didn't look back as I sped down the road, the tires skidding on the wet gravel. The next morning, I tried to find the Willowvale Inn online, but there was no trace of it. The address didn't exist, and no one I asked had ever heard of it. But I know what I saw, and sometimes when I look into a mirror, I catch a glimpse of something behind me. Something tall and thin, with a face that's just out of focus.
Story number 7.
I was never one for urban legends, but when my best friend Jake dared me to spend a night in the infamous Grayson Manor, I couldn't back down. The place had a reputation, a sprawling Victorian mansion that sat abandoned at the edge of town, shrouded in rumors of disappearances and ghostly sightings. People say anyone who spends the night there never comes back, Jake had said, his grin wide and teasing. But you're not scared, right? I wasn't about to let him think I was a coward. So, armed with my flashlight, a sleeping bag, and my phone, I walked into Grayson Manor just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The house was a towering, decaying structure. Its windows were shattered, its paint peeling, and ivy crept up its walls like a living thing. The front door groaned as I pushed it open, the sound echoing into the cavernous darkness beyond. Inside, the air was cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of mildew and rot. The grand staircase loomed ahead, its banister carved with intricate designs now dulled by years of neglect. Dust blanketed every surface, and cobwebs hung like drapes from the chandelier overhead. I set up my sleeping bag in what appeared to be the parlor, a large room with a crumbling fireplace and faded wallpaper. A broken mirror hung above the mantel, its glass cracked into a web of jagged lines. Easy, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the creeping unease. It's just an old house. As the hours passed, the silence became oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind outside set my nerves on edge. At around midnight, I heard the first sound, a faint whisper, so soft I wasn't sure if I imagined it. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and listened. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It sounded like a child's voice, but the words were indistinct, like they were being spoken underwater. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The whisper stopped. I shone my flashlight around the room, its beam cutting through the darkness. There was nothing there. Telling myself it was just the wind, I tried to settle back down. But minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was the sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, coming from upstairs. My stomach clenched. "Jake, if this is you, it's not funny," I shouted, though I knew he wasn't there. The footsteps stopped. I stood up, gripping my flashlight tightly. My instinct screamed to leave, but my pride wouldn't let me. I wasn't about to run out of here like a scared kid. I made my way to the staircase, each step creaking under my weight. The air grew colder as I ascended, and the smell of mildew intensified. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out into darkness, lined with doors that seemed to lean inward, as if watching me. The footsteps had come from the far end, near a door that was slightly ajar. I walked toward it, the floorboards groaning beneath me. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. When I reached the door, I pushed it open slowly. The room beyond was a child's bedroom, or at least it had been once. A small bed sat in the corner, its mattress rotted and springs exposed. A broken rocking horse lay on its side, and the faded remnants of wallpaper depicted cheerful animals dancing in a forest. But it was the doll that caught my attention. It sat upright in the middle of the floor, its porcelain face cracked and its empty eyes staring directly at me. I took a step back, my pulse racing, and then its head turned. It was slight, just a fraction of an inch, but I saw it. The room grew colder, my breath visible in the beam of my flashlight. I backed out of the room, my heart hammering, and bumped into something solid. I spun around, expecting to see a wall, but there was nothing there. A sharp, high-pitched laugh echoed through the hallway, bouncing off the walls and enveloping me. I ran. I didn't care about pride or dares anymore. I sprinted down the stairs, my flashlight bouncing wildly and casting grotesque shadows. As I reached the parlor, the front door slammed shut on its own with a deafening bang. I grabbed the doorknob, twisting and pulling with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like it was being held shut from the other side. Behind me, the laughter returned, low and guttural now, echoing from every corner of the room. "Who's there?" I screamed, spinning around, my back pressed against the door. The broken mirror above the fireplace caught my attention. In its fractured reflection, I saw movement, a dark figure standing behind me, its features obscured but its eyes glowing faintly. I whipped around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer. Its face was partially visible now, pale, with hollow cheeks and a jagged, bloody grin. I screamed and threw my flashlight at the mirror, shattering it into 1,000 shards. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment there was silence. Then the whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping in a chaotic chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Get out!" they hissed. The front door flew open with a violent crash, and I didn't wait to question it. I grabbed my bag and ran into the night, not stopping until I reached my car. The engine roared to life, and I tore out of the driveway, gravel spraying beneath my tires. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw the house one last time. In the upstairs window, a figure stood watching me, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. When I told Jake what had happened, he laughed, convinced I was trying to scare him. But I'll never forget the whispers, the footsteps, and the figure in the mirror. And sometimes late at night when the house is quiet, I swear I can still hear that laugh, soft and mocking, just outside my bedroom door.
Story number 8.
I never should have taken that job. I was broke and desperate, living in a city where rent was devouring most of my paycheck. So when I saw an ad for a live-in caretaker at a mansion on the outskirts of town, I jumped at the chance. The pay was good and they offered free room and board. The mansion, known as Caldwell House, was massive and gothic, perched on a hill overlooking the city. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Albright, had passed away years ago, and his estranged relatives hired me to keep an eye on the place. "It's just until the estate is sold," the lawyer said when I interviewed for the job. "Keep the property maintained. Make sure there aren't any trespassers. Simple work." Simple, they said. I moved in on a cold, rainy evening. The house was in better condition than I'd expected, given its age, but there was an undeniable air of neglect. Dust coated the furniture, cobwebs draped the corners, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. My room was on the second floor, overlooking the overgrown garden. It was sparse but functional. A bed, a small desk, and a wardrobe. The rest of the house was off limits, save for the kitchen and the living room. The first few nights were uneventful. The place was eerily quiet, save for the occasional groan of old wood. I kept busy cleaning, exploring the house only as far as I was allowed, and trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease. That changed on the fourth night. I woke to the sound of footsteps above me. They were faint at first, just a soft creak of floorboards. But as I lay there, frozen, the sound grew louder, heavier. Someone or something was walking in the attic. I grabbed my phone and checked the time, 3:12 a.m. "There's no one here," I muttered to myself, trying to steady my breathing. The house is empty. But the footsteps didn't stop. They moved slowly, deliberately, back and forth across the ceiling. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, my pulse thundering in my ears. Then, just as suddenly as they'd started, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I wasn't supposed to access the attic, but I couldn't ignore what I'd heard. Armed with a flashlight, I found the attic door at the end of the upstairs hallway. It took some effort to pull it open. The hinges were rusted, and the door seemed reluctant to move. The attic was vast and cold, filled with old furniture, trunks, and sheet-draped shapes that loomed like ghosts in the dim light. The air was thick with dust, making me cough as I stepped inside. I shone my flashlight around, half expecting to find someone hiding, but there was nothing there, just shadows and the faint smell of mildew. Relieved, but still uneasy, I left the attic and made sure to lock the door behind me. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, and they weren't alone. A low, guttural whisper accompanied them, a sound so faint I couldn't make out the words. It wasn't coming from the attic this time. It was in the hallway outside my room. I held my breath, gripping the covers tightly as the sound grew closer. The doorknob rattled. My heart nearly stopped. Something was outside my door, trying to get in. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The rattling stopped. I stared at the door, my body rigid with fear, and for a moment I thought it was over. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, a polite tap, but it quickly escalated into a frantic pounding that shook the door on its hinges. I scrambled out of bed, my mind racing. Should I open it? Call for help? But as suddenly as it started, the pounding stopped, leaving the house in an oppressive silence. When I finally mustered the courage to check the hallway, it was empty. The next morning, I called the lawyer. "Has anyone been here?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "No," he replied, sounding confused. "Why?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy. "I think someone's been in the house," I said finally. "I'll have someone check the security cameras," he said, though he sounded unconcerned. I didn't know there were cameras. I spent the day searching for them. It cast finding small, almost invisible devices in the corners of the common areas. The attic door wasn't covered, nor was the hallway near my room. That night, the activity escalated. I woke to the sound of scratching, faint and rhythmic, coming from the walls. It sounded like nails dragging against wood, slow and deliberate. The air in the room felt heavier, colder. My breath came out in white puffs as I sat up, gripping my phone like a lifeline. The scratching moved, traveling along the walls, circling me. Then came the whispering again, louder this time. "You don't belong here," it hissed, the words clear and venomous. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing my flashlight and throwing open the door. The hallway was empty, but the whispering continued, echoing around me. "Leave," it said. "Leave now." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my things and bolted for the stairs, my footsteps echoing through the house. As I reached the front door, it slammed shut on its own. A shadow moved in the corner of my eye, a tall, thin figure standing at the end of the hallway. Its face was pale and gaunt, with empty black sockets where its eyes should have been. It tilted its head, as if curious, and took a step toward me. I yanked the door open and ran into the night, not stopping until I reached my car. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure stood in the mansion's doorway, watching me. The next day, I received a call from the lawyer. "We checked the cameras," he said, his voice tight with unease. "We saw you running out of the house, but what?" I asked, gripping the phone. "There was someone following you, a tall figure, but when you reached the door, it disappeared." I didn't return to Caldwell House. I quit the job and moved to a different city, leaving the mansion and its horrors behind. But sometimes late at night, I hear the scratching again, and I know it hasn't forgotten me.